What's up, guys? We are back, Fitness Profit Multiplier, Anthony and Jimmy. And today we have on a special guest. We have on Matt from Gym Lawyers. Matt is a good friend of mine, and he runs Gym Lawyers. He's helped me with agreements. And today we're going to be discussing anything and everything to do with your lease for your business. We're going to talk about the lease agreements, and we're going to talk about some things that you can negotiate in your lease as well. So I have two locations, so I've been through this numerous times, and it cannot be a fun process. My first location actually was a one-page document that I had to sign. So my second location was 55 pages. So it can get really loopy depending on the landlord that you have. But Matt, welcome back, man. It's nice. You are officially our second guest to come on twice. Our first guest to come on twice.
Nice. Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me again. I love it.
No problem, buddy. We're excited to be here. So let's get rolling. Let's talk everything lease agreement. So you had mentioned there are three big things that we should look out for. Let's get started with that.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so first thing that we want to really be concerning ourselves with is any sort of noise ordinance or noise restrictions that come from leases. And added to Anthony, sometimes we deal with these leases and there's like 55 pages worth of a bunch of long, lofty legal language with paragraphs that take up half pages at a time, and you got to dig through what crap you're actually agreeing to. But when we're talking to gym owners, we've got to watch noise, because if we're all going to make noise, right? I mean, that's bottom line. And if the lease has a noise restriction, then that right there, we have to return that lease to the gym owner and say, you can't sign it. You can't sign the lease as long as there's a noise restriction in here. So this is usually going to pop up in sort of two or three different locations within the lease that we look for. First is going to be the use of premises. Right? Every lease, even those one-pagers, is going to have what's called a use of premise section, and that's where you say you're going to be operating a gym. And oftentimes the landlords don't know what it is that we're doing, so they like to just put in there that we're just going to run like a gym, or we're going to be running a fitness facility or something really neutral like that. And they don't realize that when we're coming in and we're running a fitness facility, we're going to be playing loud noise, we're going to be running around the parking lot, we're going to be dropping weights, we're going to be slamming balls down on the ground, we're picking up Atlas stones and dropping them if you do that in powerlifting gym, whatever it is. And we're potentially going to piss off the neighbors. So that's sort of number one when we're talking about noise, is we look at the use of premises and we want it to be defined. And I usually give some sort of like general language, like, the tenant will be operating a fitness facility that is known to cause noise and use the surrounding area as part of its program.
Does that include outside when you say language like that, Matt?
Yeah, and that's why I add that little end blurb in there of use the premises surrounding the building, or however we want to define that, because I ran into this issue with my own lease. Our building shares space with another tenant, and they were really mad when we first opened, and I sent people out on 400-meter runs or 800-meter runs, and their employees are driving in and out of the parking lot having to watch for our people. That created a big issue. So I had in my lease that we would be using the surrounding area, and it's important for you as the gym owner to be putting the landlord on notice of what it is you're going to be doing. And that's one of those, along with the noise. So that's sort of the first area is in the use of premise that we want to be concerning ourselves with noise.
We had some interesting, Matt, this brings up what happened in my first facility, or my second facility. We moved to a bigger location. We had some noise issues. Our neighbors were getting pissed off at deadlifts and med ball slams and things like that, right? Changed our program around a little bit because our landlord got on our case about it, and then looked through the lease with a fine-tooth comb and there was an addendum that was added to the lease when
Mhm.
we moved from one space to another space in the same building that was extremely vague, right?
Yep.
It was like, tenant may produce noise that could be disturbing to other tenants,
Yep.
something of that nature, right? So even with that in the lease, I still signed it for the second space. And they came at me with, well, we need to soundproof these walls and it's going to cost $80,000 and we're just going to put it on your tab. And then I said, talk to my lawyer, and hired somebody. And basically all they did was call him up and said, my tenant's not breaking any laws, so you can't do anything to him. And it just like went away. And it was
Yeah.
super. And then I continued to rent from them and continued, and then eventually moved out to the space I'm in now. But it was something that we fought because of how vague the language was. So it was an interesting learning experience for me from the legal standpoint, because I didn't, fine tooth comb look through it before I had the event happen, but because the language was so vague, my lawyer was able to like kind of massage it out of being an issue for me. So
Mhm.
it was kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
And you also got lucky that the landlord sort of let you off on that as well.
Right.
Because when they deliberately put that vague language in there, and what you brought to light there is sort of the number 3 area where we look for these noise restrictions, which is in either, sometimes they'll call them like attachment rules or addendums or something like that to the lease, where you get to the end of your 35-page lease, and then there's all of a sudden there's an attachment on the end of it that has a whole list of like, you can't leave trash outside, you can't have overnight parkers, and then buried in like paragraph number 6 is this little thing that'll say something like, you can't do anything that is going to annoy the neighbors, including burning hazardous materials and or causing obnoxious noise. And it's like, what is that? Like,
Right.
what? And you're exactly right. It's real vague. And so what we'll do is if we see that, first thing we do is we go back to the gym owner and say, don't sign. And the second thing we do is say, if you are going to sign, you need to have a conversation with the landlord that says, this is what we're going to be doing. I'm going to drop a 450-pound deadlift on the ground. It's going to shake the building. If that's obnoxious noise, I can't sign the lease. But we've got to get something a little bit more specifically defined here as to what is this obnoxious noise. Because you have the prime example. You get in there, you think, whatever, like this is a vague term. I'm not going to violate this. Then you get in there, and all of a sudden you got a headache with your landlord.
Yeah, it was years of a headache. It was them coming back over, doing sound tests and having people come in, and then my neighbor coming over into my space and complaining to me. Gosh. It was, and the funniest thing was the neighbor was a pawn shop that was complaining. The nail salon on the other side didn't complain, but the pawn shop complained the whole time. And we won on this technicality that was like, the landlord just decided to stop fighting it because there was some technical RC value that was like some retail, there was some value that they had figured out that meant that I wasn't breaking any laws. So then they just kind of left it at that. But yes, it was a huge headache. So maybe in the future, when I see that in leases, I won't sign, because it was a pain in the ass for about 3 years straight. So yeah.
And sort of that point, what you were talking about there is probably a local ordinance noise restriction. And we've now seen that, the second place that we'll look for this stuff in the leases is right in the middle of the body of the lease, that some landlords will put in there that restricts the tenant from producing noise that exceeds a certain decibel level. And that may or may not comply with, or be in conjunction with the local noise ordinances. So you probably got off with it because your attorney looked at the local noise ordinance and said, after all of this testing, he's not exceeding the local noise ordinance. So, you can't say that he's producing too much obnoxious noise. We've seen it, a lot of times. I won't pick on California, but we've seen this a couple of times pop up in California for some reason over other states, where in the smack dab in the middle of the lease, it'll say things like, tenant cannot exceed noise of 50 decibels. And it's like, well, that's going to be tough because
it's not very
my
loud.
music alone is like 100 decibels. So.
Yeah.
And guys, if you're sitting there listening to this, like, all of this doesn't really pertain to me, it's good knowledge to know. So, like, I didn't even know what my lease says about noise. So I'm not even sure. But it's good to be aware of these things. So maybe take a look at your lease and look at what's going on in there. I mean, if no one's complaining, I wouldn't worry about it. But you never know. A tenant can move in next to you and just be like Jimmy said,
Right.
like the pawn shop, and really get on your case about these things. So it's good to kind of be a little bit proactive and look. And if you're looking for a second location, or you're looking to move your current location, make sure you have somebody comb through and make sure that these things are in there so that you are protected from a potential headache. And in Jimmy's case, it would have cost him 80 grand to fix, and for nothing, for no reason. So
Yep.
this is why Matt's here, and this is why this is number one on our three big things we should look out for in your lease agreement.
Yeah, and to that point, Anthony, before I move on to the next one, if you're in a building that shares with another tenant and you've got a 6-year lease, there's a good chance that another tenant is going to move in the other space. And just because you're not getting noise ordinance complaints now, or noise complaints, doesn't mean that it can't happen. And when your current lease comes up for renewal, if it currently has a noise restriction in it, that's a great time to ask for that noise restriction to be removed, just to head off anybody else moving into the building that could then all of a sudden decide they don't like you and they want to create an issue for it. Yeah. Okay.
All right, let's roll into number two.
Number two, how much are you actually going to pay every month? This is another big one, especially for new gym owners who are trying to work on a budget, and they're desperate to find a space, and they end up signing a lease that they think they're only paying $3,500 a month, and they end up paying $4,700 a month because they didn't understand the full amount of costs that were worked into the lease. Okay, so for this, there's really two primary types of commercial leases, and there's subsets within there, but two primary costs. There's a gross lease and there's a net lease. Okay, people would commonly know this as like a triple net, but it could be a double net. It doesn't have to be a triple net. A gross lease is basically my lease says, I'm going to pay $3,500 a month for my space, and it doesn't matter the landlord's costs. It doesn't matter what utilities are. I will just pay $3,500 a month for my space. That's a gross lease. Great, sign it. You don't have to worry about it going up until it comes up for renewal. Alternatively, you have the net lease, and this is where people get into trouble, because the net lease is going to have probably about 3 different numbers. And again, it can vary, but about 3 different numbers that are going to vary how much you pay each month. The first number is going to be your base rent. What is your square footage that you're going to pay for each month in base rent? Let's just say it's $3,500 a month. Okay. The next number that's going to work into that is going to be what are called CAM fees, which are common area maintenance fees. There's other names for it, but that's what, the general name is a CAM fee. A CAM fee is really going to cover just about every cost to the landlord. So we're talking about things like snow removal, maintenance fees, property taxes, insurance premiums. Anything that the landlord absorbs yearly is going to come back on you as a CAM fee, and it's going to be divided up over the month. And so let's just say that ends up being $500. And I can go into sort of how those things are calculated, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds right this second. So, now your CAM fee is maybe another $500 a month, and a lease may not tell you what the CAM fee is. It may just tell you that there is a CAM fee. So we then have to go back to the landlord and ask what specifically that's going to be. But now all of a sudden, your base rent was $3,500 a month. Your CAM fee is $500 a month. So you're up to $4,000 a month for your rent. And then again, if you're looking at something like a triple net lease, now you have to take into account utilities as well. Utility or some utilities, but not all utilities included in the CAM fees? Are you responsible for all utilities separate from CAM fees? So now you have to put all of your utilities in your individual business name, and all of those are then going to be tacked on in addition, not necessarily to your monthly rent, but as an additional cost each month. So now you've got $4,000 in rent plus whatever your electric is, whatever your water is, whatever your heating costs are, all of that. Sometimes, like, I'll see leases that still talk about telephone utilities. Like, we don't need telephone utilities anymore. We've all got cell phones. So we have to be aware that that stuff's going to be lumped in there as well.
Yeah, that always confused me. And I wish I would have had this episode before I signed my leases, because I was in the beginning, I was like, what the hell does any of this mean? I didn't know what a CAM fee was. I didn't know any of that stuff. So it's cool to hear it like again. And I think that'll help somebody looking for a lease right now, making sure those hidden little things that are in there. It's actually funny. If you want to be a landlord, a commercial landlord is probably the best way to be a landlord, because they cover everything.
Oh, yeah. Right. And the other factor that you really have to watch for when we're talking about CAM fees, and I'll go into the weeds a little bit on it, is the CAM fee is likely going to be variable every year. So if you own a house, then you're perhaps a little bit familiar with this when it comes to like your escrows. Okay, like part of your mortgage payment each month, likely to your mortgage company, includes your local property taxes and things like that. And the mortgage company then takes that portion, they put it over into an escrow account, and they use that to pay your local taxes. And then at the end of the year, they do a reconciliation. And if your taxes exceeded what was in escrow, then they're going to send you a bill for that. And you can either lump sum pay that shortage, or you can have your mortgage payment go up each year and in an effort to try to catch up to the escrow shortage. Okay. Your CAM fee is going to work the same way. So let's say in the year of 2022, the landlord makes an estimate of what your CAM fees are going to be, and then it gets divided amongst your square footage, and then it gets divided for 12, and that gets added on to your base rent. Then at the end of 2022, the landlord's going to do a reconciliation of the total costs. And you're going to get a statement from the landlord that shows either you overpaid, and so you'll get a little bit of a credit, you paid exactly right, which never happens, or likely you underpaid for your CAM fees through all of 2022. And so what's then going to happen in 2023 is, first, you'll have to make a lump sum payment to make up the difference in the CAM fees. And then your monthly rent is going to go up every month because your CAM fees are going to go up in order to try to compensate for that increased amount that the landlord realized in 2022. So you have to, if you have a triple net, you have to predict that not only do you have to cover all of these fees, but your rent is likely to go up every year, every month. That all makes sense. That's hard to explain, but.
Yeah, 100%. And Matt, I don't know if you were going to go over this too, but they'll work into leases that there's like 3% bumps in rent every year as well, right? Not just your CAM differences, but like, and you got to know that that's there if it is. Some leases I've signed don't have it, some have,
right?
And it's just, there's hidden costs that you're not going to realize when you go in and you just go, oh, the square footage is this and the rent is this per square foot. And if that's all you calculate, you could be paying thousands of dollars more than what you anticipated.
Yeah, you can. And usually, and I'll say usually, but if there's an increase in rent and you have like a 6-year, let's say you have a 6-year lease, and there's going to be a 3% increase, usually we'll see a chart within the lease that will show, first year your amount is going to be this. Next year, maybe your total yearly plus the monthly breakdown is going to be this, right? But you may not see a nice little chart like that showing you that it's going to increase, and it'll just say your rent will increase by 3%. Your base rent will increase by 3% every year. And it'll be hidden in there and probably under a section of base rent in the last sentence of this big paragraph. And if you miss it, you miss it. You gotta, again, sit down. I always joke, you really need to sit down with a pot of coffee and like dive into this stuff and try not to go to sleep, because it gets very heavy very fast.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really learning along my fitness entrepreneurial journey is that it pays to have somebody in your corner to really look out for this stuff, and you want to avoid paying the stupid tax as often as you can. So
Yeah.
when you have the opportunity to have an expert, a set of eyes look over things for you, take that time. Yes, you might not want to pay that money. Yes, you might not want to make that investment, but it's an investment well worth it. So, like for example, if Jimmy didn't have that little clause in his thing, and he might have had to pay $80,000. That's a big headache. But if he would have had somebody look over that contract and found it for him, it would have saved him money. So these things, while they sound like, okay, yeah, it's important to have somebody look over this stuff, is all I'm saying, and to avoid paying the stupid tax for yourself.
And some of it's it's hard to eat on the episode generally is to understand that almost everything within a lease is somewhat negotiable. Okay, it never hurts to go back and ask. One of the ways that we try it at times, if we report back to a gym owner about these triple net fees, and the gym owner starts to realize, oh crap, I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford this, and they have to try to negotiate. Something you can do is, instead of seeing, like a 3% a 3% increase each year, plus this variable CAM fee on top of it, what you can do is you can try to say, look, I'll pay a little bit more in the, let's say the first 2 years, which will then level out in the second 2 years, and then I'll pay a little bit more in the last 2 years, and you try to set what those percentages will be in addition to CAM fees. You try to set what those percentage increases will be and give you a little bit more predictability. So, that variability can understandably really scare small business owners at times, because, especially as gym owners, we've got fine margins, and, a 5% increase because of a 3% plus CAM fee increase next year can really hurt, just to pay for the space.
Yeah, great point. Great point. So let's let's talk about that third one. So the third big issue that we need to look out for. This one is the one that I'm really excited to hear about. So let's get into the third one quick here.
The dreaded personal guarantee. So, all right, let me back up and give a little bit of
Wait,
background.
let me actually jump in really quick on
that. Yeah, go.
Right before you say this, I talked about paying the stupid tax. So this is one that you want to listen to, because you want to make sure that you have your T's crossed and your I's dotted with this one.
Yeah. Okay. So hopefully everybody takes step number one when they want to start a business, and that is filing either for an LLC or a corporation. I have an LLC. Anthony, I believe you have a corporation. It doesn't really make a difference for these purposes. That's a different episode. But at that point, once you have those filed and moving forward, you want everything to be, all these contracts, these leases, everything we're talking about, to be signed on behalf of that LLC or corporation. That way, it tries to protect you as much as possible when it comes to your own personal asset liability. All right. Landlords know this, though. Okay, so if I go in with my LLC and I try to sign my lease in the name of my LLC and I'm a brand new business, landlords know that there's a good chance, unfortunately, that I'm going to fail. And if I'm signing a 5-year lease, that 5-year mark is that's like the mark for a successful business. If you can make it past the first 5 years, you're probably good to go. But there's a chance you're going to fail in that first 5 years. And the landlord doesn't want to end up with his empty pockets 3 years in, because my business failed, because if all I did was sign on behalf of my LLC, cool, I'm just going to file bankruptcy, and that's going to help me get out from under these lease payments. So in an effort to try to avoid that, the landlord is going to take one of two or both steps of tying me personally to that commercial lease. The primary way he's going to do this is through the personal guarantee. The other way that he can do this is by having me named as an individual on the lease. And I'll go down that path if you guys want me to, but that's a little bit, that we don't see that quite as often. Usually what we see is if the named tenant party to the lease is going to be the LLC, then almost always attached to the very end of the lease is going to be this personal guarantee. And what that does is that requires me, or whoever the business owners are, if there's more than one, then it's going to require all of them to sign a document that says, basically, if my business fails and it doesn't make one of its monthly rental payments, the landlord can come after me as an individual in order to continue to make those monthly payments.
So the looming question that I always have in the air is, and I hate to think this way, but it's always good to be a little bit more cautious than it is anything else. So I start a business, I'm opening up my location, whatever it is, and I just don't make it. Maybe I have the wrong business model and all the things that we talk about on this podcast and in our FPM history here. The wrong business model, your lease is too much, you're not charging enough. All of these things kind of come to a head, and I can't make it anymore. How do I get out of my lease? What do I do? What happens in that case? I've always wondered that.
Yeah, it can be a very, very scary time. The absolute worst case scenario is that you try to ignore the issue, you do absolutely nothing, and then all of a sudden one day you have to close your business and walk away, because that's going to really tick off that landlord. And if you sign the personal guarantee, you can assume you're going to be nailed with a lawsuit in order to pay out the rest of your lease. And unfortunately, that is sort of a reality of the situation, because you are signing a contract, right? You're signing a contract in which you agree, first, on behalf of the LLC or the corporation, to pay every month, or second, that you as the individual owner will then pay if the business cannot pay. Okay, so before you just get to the point where you literally have to shut the door and walk away, if you see that the business is starting to go downhill, and you need to look at yourself in the mirror and just say, I gave it a good shot and it's not going to work, unfortunately. And now it's time to start taking steps in order to avoid some of this liability. And the first thing you need to do is call your landlord and say, hey, landlord, I know we signed this whole lease, but frankly, I'm failing. We had a saying in law school that you can't get blood from a turnip, and so you go to your landlord and you say, landlord, look, I'm failing. I'm unfortunately, this didn't make it, and you can't get blood from a turnip. So I'd really like to try to work with you so that you can avoid all of the costs coming after me for money that I'm not going to have, right? And so let's start looking for other tenants to move in and take over my lease, because there's two things a landlord hates. Well, let's say three things a landlord hates. One is an empty space, right? Two is trying to track down tenants for their payments, right? And three is turning over spaces. The landlord's ideal is that a tenant is just there and they make their regular monthly payments and the landlord doesn't have to worry about it. So if you see the ship is going down, and you can reach out to your landlord and say, the ship's going down, I've probably got 3 months left. So can we please just put the space back on the market, and I'll help any way that I can, but let's try to get another tenant in here, right? And I'll make my final 3 months payment while we're waiting for that other tenant to move in. In some sense, that's ideal for the landlord, because the landlord is now guaranteeing, quote unquote, that they're going to get the next 3 months payment, while also hopefully then just having somebody else walk back into the space as you leave.
And what would happen if your landlord says like, no? Can that happen? I mean, I guess
Yeah,
it could,
sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah. The landlord, and I can't say I've had a situation to date where the landlord was that unreasonable. I've had clients say that they believe their landlord will be that unreasonable and then surprise them, but I don't know that I've had a situation where a landlord has literally been that unreasonable. Again, because the landlord doesn't want to have to come after you for the money. It's going to cost the landlord so much in attorney's fees and everything else to try to come after you for years, only to then find out, there's tons of other roadblocks. Let me just, I'll get, I'll go down this path for a second. Anthony, let's say you're married and all of your property is jointly owned between you and your wife. Your bank accounts are jointly owned, your cars are jointly owned, your house is jointly owned, everything's jointly owned, but you are the only person who owned your business. You are the only one who signed a personal guarantee. Okay, well, now your business is failing and the landlord's going to come after first your corporation for the money, but you're going to file bankruptcy and get out from under the lease, likely on that. Okay, then the landlord's going to try to come after you individually for it. Fine, you can't really fight that too much because you signed the personal guarantee. So the landlord now has a judgment against you, and the landlord's going to try to collect on that judgment. The problem there is that in most states, the landlord or a judgment cannot be executed on jointly owned property if the judgment is only against one individual. So if the judgment is only against you, Anthony, and all of your personal assets are owned jointly, then the landlord's going to have a real hard time getting any money off of you whatsoever. So the landlord has now absorbed all of this time, all of this cost, all of these attorney's fees and everything else to only get to the end of the road and have a really hard time making any of their money. And they don't want to do that. And they know that that's a potential issue and they don't want to do it.
That's super interesting. So if the landlord lets you get out of the lease, you should absolutely get the landlord to sign something saying that you're out of the lease. Like, how does that work then if they're so that you'd have to send the landlord something to sign so you're good?
Yeah. The landlord would end up with some sort of an assignment document or something to the new tenant. They would enter in a new lease with the new tenant and void yours, and there would just be something in writing that says that your lease is void and your obligation has ended.
Nice. All
Yeah.
right. So we discussed the three big things to look out for in the lease agreement. Is there anything else that we want to roll into on that one? Because I'd love to shift gears right now and talk about everything lease negotiations, because I think that that's a really cool topic for gym owners, especially when they're going to sign a lease.
No, look, I'll just leave it at those three big things because if we're going to talk about negotiations, the personal guarantee is a hot area for negotiation. So I'll withhold anything else on the personal guarantee until that.
All right, cool. So